Paul. Welcome, everybody, and it's my pleasure to introduce our panel, as I will do shortly. I would like to thank Paul and Kevin for all of their work in putting this together, and we're very fortunate to have the panel that we have this evening. First, I would like to introduce Tom Ellison, who is a Deputy Director of the Center for Climate and Security. Prior to joining the center, he spent a decade in the U.S. intelligence community, where he helped expand analysis of the security and foreign policy implications of climate change for senior policymakers across the U.S. government. Previously, he received commendations for intelligence analysis of terrorist threats, insurgencies, and political turmoil during the Arab Spring. Mr. Ellison is an Arab speaker and holds an MA in Security Studies from Georgetown University and a BA from Political Science from Colgate University. Dr. Marcus King is a professor of practice in the Environment and International Affairs in the Science and Technology in International Affairs program at Georgetown University's Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service. Prior to Georgetown, Dr. King was the John O. Rankin Associate Professor of International Affairs and Director of Master of Arts in International Affairs program at George Washington University. Dr. King also draws on experience from organizations including a research and analyst at CNA Corporation Center for Naval Analyses, as a research director of Sustainable Energy Institute, and a senior manager for energy and security programs at a private consultancy. Dr. King is the vice chairman of the Council of Strategic Risks and a member of the Center for Climate and Security's advisory board. His most recent book, Weaponizing Water, Water Stress, and Islamic Extremist Violence in Africa and the Middle East, has been recently published. Ms. Marisol Maddox is a senior Arctic analyst at the Polar Institute of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. Her research considers the nexus of the Arctic, climate change, and security and geopolitics. She is particularly interested in how the growing presence of actorless threats, such as climate change and biodiversity loss, interplays with traditional security challenges and strategic thinking. Ms. Maddox previously contributed expertise as a member of the Newport Arctic Scholars Initiative at the U.S. Naval War College and co-led the International Climate Working Group at Foreign Policy for America's Next Gen initiative. She frequently publishes and speaks on Arctic security and geopolitics. Her commentary has been featured in the New York Times, the LA Times, Arctic Today, Business Insider, Science, and the Bulletin of Atomic Sciences, among other outlets. Ms. Maddox holds an MA in International Security with a concentration in transnational challenges from George Mason's University Shar School. She holds a BA in Environmental Studies with a concentration in ecosystems from Binghamton University. Dr. John McNeill is Distinguished University Professor at Georgetown University. He's authored and edited more than 20 books, including Something New Under the Sun, listed by the London Times among the 10 best science books ever written. And he says, despite being a history book, and Mosquito Empires, which won the Beveridge Prize from the American Historical Association, and most recently, The Webs of Humankind. He has served as the president of both the American Society of Environmental History and the American Historical Association, and is an elected member of both the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the Academia Europaea. In 2018, he received the Heineken Award for History from the Royal Netherlands Academy of Arts and Sciences. Colonel Mark Reed was commissioned as a second lieutenant in infantry upon graduation from the United States Military Academy in 1992 with a Bachelor of Science in Environmental Engineering. Colonel Reed holds a Master of Science and a Doctor of Philosophy and Geography from the Pennsylvania State University, where he studied climate variability and change and the security implications of climate change. Colonel Reed spent much of his career in a variety of operational infantry units in US, Europe, and the Middle East. He also has served on the faculty at West Point, where he is currently assigned as a professor and head of the Department of Geography and Environmental Engineering. He recently spent 6 months in US AFRICOM, helping the command understand and plan for the security implications of climate change in Africa. His academic interests include climate variability and change, environmental security, and military geography. So I'm very pleased that we have such an esteemed group of scholars to speak with us tonight. As a few introductory comments, tonight's panel forms under the general milieu of environmental security, and I have a definition up there for you. We're looking at violent conflict that may be triggered based on the effects of the climate and adverse environmental effects. This doctrine suggests that climate change may intensify extant political and socioeconomic and environmental challenges, thus generating a range of security concerns. The real question when we look at climate change and its effects on climate is often the causal effects. It's difficult to draw a direct causal line from climate change or an adverse environmental effect and warfare. It is difficult indeed. But it is one lens by now our government in particular, along with many other intergovernmental panels, are now looking at the global security landscape. Many people think that this type of violence is only a function of political and military factors. However, I put this index together to try to get us to understand the scope of the problem. As you can see here, it is quite large. We're looking at more than 50% of the countries in the world are either at risk or highly vulnerable to conflict enabled or triggered by adverse environmental effects. And as far as the causal effects, I generally tell people that the least likely theory is that the climate plays no role at all in this type of environment. So what I'd like to do is turn our panel now over to our first speaker, Mr. Tom Ellison.
Sure. Thank you, Frank, and thank you, everyone, for putting together this really great collection of experts. I'm really excited to speak to everyone. I'll just offer some introductory comments and kind of framing remarks that I hope will set the stage for some of the great experts we have after me to dive more deeply into. So I'm going to share my screen. Just one moment. Great. So as I said, I'm really excited to be with you all today. This is just a brief roadmap of what I'll plan to talk about. Just give a brief introduction about where I'm coming from, a bit of context on climate change from sort of the security perspective, which I hope isn't too basic for this audience, but I think is important to sort of set the stage. And then a little bit on how I think about at least the different sort of types of climate-related security risks you might want to consider, and then a few closing thoughts on policymaking and where we are in terms of the role of security institutions on this issue. I won't spend too much time on this, but I'm coming from the Center for Climate and Security, which has been around for over a decade looking at these issues and really trying to make climate change policy security smart and vice versa, make security policy climate change smart, both of which are needed as we move into this chapter. But from there, I'll start with a little bit of context that I think is important to help me frame my thinking around this issue, and less sort of the nitty-gritty science, as I'm far from a scientist, but more the kind of concepts and dynamics that emerge from climate change as a phenomenon that I think are important to shaping it as a geopolitical security or defense problem. And I'll start just with this graph, just making the fairly obvious point, right, that hopefully is familiar to everyone on this webinar, right? But the UN's climate science panel, the IPCC, calls it unequivocal, a word they don't use lightly. That human activity, burning fossil fuels, land use, et cetera, is causing global warming that's really unprecedented when we look at sort of the niche that modern society has evolved in, and a lot of the characteristics that in the security community, when we do our analysis, we kind of take for granted. So going back to Frank's comments about the causal linkages that people debate, which can certainly be debated, when you start to change variables like temperature and pH, right, that are about as fundamental as gravity, right, those changes kind of have to cascade through these natural and human systems in some way. And so they're affecting that equilibrium that we've kind of taken for granted. And we're entering into this kind of uncharted territory in that sense. And addressing that is going to be essential, but it also requires really wide-ranging changes that bring their own challenges. And we'll get some more comments from a real expert with Dr. John McNeill on where this kind of sits in a historical perspective. But with that increase in greenhouse gases and global temperatures, we can expect this range of disruptive changes across the climate system, which I don't need to rattle off individually here, but that all have various direct and indirect disruptive effects on things that affect human lives and livelihoods, whether it's food or water or health or other things that can eventually lead to human or national or global security problems. Those are sort of the changes we can expect fairly linearly. And then you also have these things that are often referred to as tipping points, right? These various parts of the climate system where scientists tell us that there are potential thresholds we could cross of warming where you have a more rapid or self-perpetuating or irreversible change in the climate that could have more sudden or catastrophic consequences. And I just point this out because in the security and national security type community, we often talk about things like black swan or low probability, high impact events, and sometimes that language gets applied to these types of tipping point issues. But if you look at this graph, they're not necessarily that low probability, at least all of them, right? Many of these are estimated to be at risk of occurring at 2 degrees or lower of warming, which, as we'll get to, we're currently on pace for well more than 2 degrees of warming. So they're not necessarily that unlikely. The other contextual point I'll just put here again, which I hope is not too obvious, but a key characteristic that shapes climate change as a sort of political and economic and consequentially a security challenge is the big, huge kind of inequity and injustice component between cause and effect, right? Where generally those most harmed, those most vulnerable to climate change, those poor, still developing, fragile countries are those that are not as responsible for causing climate change historically, which tend to be rich, advanced, longer industrialized economies. And so that's not just a big justice question, but it's also what makes this problem so difficult to tackle as a collective action problem, as a diplomatic challenge. Because how you count these things and how you apportion responsibility has big implications for who has to act, how quickly, and who has to bear what burden to take that action. So that leaves us where we are now, where the world has essentially been trying to mobilize itself to stop or slow or reverse climate change since the UN's Climate Change Convention came into being in 1992. And to summarize a lot of history, many previous efforts essentially sank over those same developed and developing world divisions. And we've since arrived at the Paris Agreement framework since 2016, which sort of relies on a structure of peer pressure and transparency around emissions and a process to sort of amplify that peer pressure and transparency to encourage emissions cuts, but not mandate any particular amount of emissions cuts by any particular country. And then tries to mobilize aid of various sorts from the developed world to the developing world to help them reduce their emissions and adapt to climate change to sort of surmount that sticking point of that developing world gap. And we've settled on 1.5 or 2 degrees as the key target to limit global warming to over the long term, after which impacts get more catastrophic or potentially irreversible. But today we're already at well over 1 degree, 1.1 or 1.2 degrees. At our current trajectory, it's estimated with our current policies, it's estimated we'll breach 1.5 degrees by the end of this decade, perhaps, and ultimately maybe settle around 2.7 degrees without further policy action. so that target is very much in question. And as you can see, looking at this graph here of potential emissions trajectories going forward and what that means for temperature rise, climate action has significantly reduced the amount of global warming we would have otherwise faced, but obviously not enough, as you can see, to get to that 1.5 or 2 degree target. And additionally, we're often seeing science these days that shows impacts that are faster or more intense at a given level of warming than we might have estimated before. But the other contextual point I want to make is that, even if we were in the best case scenario, right now we're looking at a graph of temperature rise, and these are all different scenarios for, lower curves that would get us closer to that 1.5 or 2 degree target, and then higher, more fossil fuel dependent trajectories where we get more climate change. But from a security and a risk management perspective, the important point is that these all involve increased temperature rise from here, right? Even in a best case scenario, a near miraculous scenario where we hit that 1.5 degree target, we're still in for several decades of continued temperature rise. So the only question is, how fast and how much, and can we bring it back down? And that's where you get this kind of responsibility, including of the security community. You get this idea of, avoid the unmanageable, but manage the unavoidable. So security practitioners and policymakers, have to make decisions in situations of uncertainty. And with a situation like this, where you have very high consequences and very, high likelihood of those consequences coming about, there's an imperative to plan to adapt to mitigate those consequences and challenges that will come from that continued temperature rise, which again is is going to almost certainly continue for certainly most of my working life, right, several decades into mid-century, even in an optimistic scenario. So now just hitting on how I kind of think about a bit of a framework for what these types of risks are, and I'd be curious other panelists' thoughts on this. But a few key themes that jump out to me when thinking about this is, one is the importance of systems thinking, right? It's not just about what a given amount of heat does to a bridge, right? We live in an environment, and our security is underpinned by an environment of mutually interdependent systems, natural and human systems. Whether that's the food or energy or water system, or or actual Earth climate systems, or political and governance systems, right? They all interact with each other and depend on each other to function well. And so it's really important to take those ways that multiple impacts cascade and compound and amplify or potentially blunt each other into account. The other important theme is the adaptive capacity, the coping capacity, the resilience of a given place is as important or potentially more important than the actual climate hazard, how hot the heat wave is or how high the sea level rise is in determining the severity of the outcome, right? 100 degrees with air conditioning is a very different thing than 100 degrees without air conditioning, right? We all kind of intuitively understand that. And that same idea applies when we're looking at the security landscape. The political, social, economic context and resources available is really important to determining the ultimate impact of some of these climate changes. And the last point I would make is just that the direct and indirect effects are both important, as are the direct and indirect effects of climate policies, not just climate change itself, but some of the dramatic changes we are making and will have to make to slow and reverse, halt and ultimately reverse climate change. Transitioning from a fossil fuel to a low carbon energy system, dramatically increasing conservation, transforming the agriculture and food system. These are all dramatic and potentially disruptive changes themselves that could be potentially destabilizing if pursued poorly. So that's what leads me to this fairly, crude little graphic that I think about of, and maybe this goes slightly broader than Frank's environmental security framing before, but I'd be curious people's thoughts on it. But, looking at the direct and indirect effects of not just climate change impacts itself, right? The heat waves, the sea level rise, the flooding, the precipitation, how those interact and cascade across different systems of politics and defense and security, but also the same look at climate change policies, right? How that, lifting of fuel subsidies and transitioning energy systems and changing land use has its own security consequences and challenges. Because when we think about climate and security, we often think about this upper left, which is certainly important. It's sort of the first thing that comes to mind. But I would posit that all these others are very impactful as well, and they all interact with each other as well. Going back to that systems thinking comment from before. So just to give a few examples and maybe tee up some of the future comments, right? So when we think about climate change and its direct effects that impact security, right? We might think of things like the upper left, climate change, worsening the water, health, food security of vulnerable populations, right? Spurring displacement or loss of livelihoods that has security consequences. We might think of declining agricultural yields from changes in temperature that affect that can cause conflict over resource scarcity or spur migration or hinder the economy, or direct damage like you see on the right here to military bases. In the upper right, you have hurricane damage to a US Air Force base, and the bottom right, you have an example of how extreme heat can literally melt a military air runway. These are all examples of those direct effects. And then as those effects kind of cascade and have their indirect consequences, you have their indirect, their second and third order impacts, right? So you have maybe more opportunities for terrorist groups or other illicit actors to exploit vulnerable populations or to benefit from resource scarcity, right? As you see on the left with the ISIS example. And Dr. Marcus King will be speaking in detail more about that exact topic. You might have, for example, changes in military posture and balance of power, right? For example, China's posture in the South China Sea, being somewhat dependent on artificial island outposts that are increasingly vulnerable to things like storms, right? How does that affect the military planning around that, potentially conflict-prone area, right? Or minority groups being scapegoated for wildfires in Turkey, or the Arctic opening up to greater geopolitical competition and exploration, as Marisol Maddox will speak to later in this panel. And then moving into the policies and their potential effects, right? You have militaries, adapting their equipment and their capabilities, both to reduce their own emissions and also just for purely operational reasons, like you see with this hybrid electric tactical vehicle the Army's pursuing. You have users from the energy transition, from fossil fuel dependent economies to a low carbon energy economy that's much more dependent on minerals and inputs like copper and lithium and cobalt and other things that that involve different winners and losers and involve a dramatic expansion of mining and extraction that you can see in that middle picture. That's lithium extraction going on. Is very environmentally disruptive, very contentious, often causes conflict and protest already. Or you have economic policies that try to price in the problematic nature of fossil fuels, can cause popular backlash, as you see, and just one of many examples of subsidy lifts causing popular backlash. And then finally, those policies, they also have their own cascading indirect effects that might affect new social movements, the role of militaries in society. In the upper right, you have a Slovenian military helicopter fighting wildfires, and they're one military that's really wrestling with, what is their role? Like, they're balancing the Ukraine conflict, but also increasingly turning resources to essentially being climate first responders. So I know I'm hitting my time quickly, but just a few thoughts on where that leaves us policymaking wise. There's been a kind of a bipartisan consensus, at least in the US, on the importance of climate change as a national security threat to the US military. And then more broadly than that, the Biden administration particularly has prioritized climate change as a security and foreign policy issue. And you see it, in a slate of regional plans and intelligence documents and DoD risk analyses and other products. And now the challenge is really resourcing, implementing, and institutionalizing those efforts, right? Moving from acknowledgement to action, putting it into everyday course of business for the security apparatus of the United States. And then more broadly, this is playing out internationally, where the UN Security Council has tried and failed to reach consensus on incorporating climate issues. You have U.S. allies and partners moving in their own pace and direction to incorporate these issues, and then militaries responding in real time, right, to again, often as sort of default first responders, as we've seen in these screenshots related to the catastrophic flooding in Pakistan last year. And so that just leaves us with a few, I'll offer kind of a few questions to keep in mind about the role of security institutions going forward. One is how will they handle increased demand for humanitarian assistance and disaster relief in concert with their other, traditional quote unquote roles? How will they adapt their training, their equipment, their infrastructure, et cetera, to be effective in a climate change world? How will they, or to what extent will they reduce their own emissions, right? Militaries are often a large source of emissions themselves. And how do you do that while maintaining operational effectiveness? Do militaries have, what role might they play in moving markets and helping commercialize some of the technologies that the wider world will need to combat climate change? You think about the internet or GPS, these technologies that started with a defense application and are now ubiquitous. There's a lot of hope that a similar, defense interest in clean energy or other technologies will have a similar effect. And then finally, kind of two sides of the coin in these last 2 points, right? For good or bad, militaries worldwide are often extremely influential in their government's policies, often more than, the ministries of the environment. And so their engagement on this issue is good insofar as it raises the attention of the issue in different governments around the world. But at the same time, right, militaries, they often become first responders by default. But, it's an open question, in what context, in what countries, in what climate scenario is the military the right tool to be that first responder, right? And this is especially perhaps the case with, politically dominant militaries that have maybe a more problematic role in their society, maybe corruption problems or human rights issues, right? Think Pakistan or Egypt. What is the proper role for them to play in responding to these climate-related hazards and instability issues? And I think we'll hear more from one of our speakers, Colonel Reed, as well about AFRICOM and his work on in the U.S. military to wrestle with some of these issues. So I will close my comments there, but I'm really looking forward to hearing the rest of the presentations and discussing some of the questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom. So we will turn it over to Dr. John McNeill. And while John is getting his slides ready to go, I will ask our audience, if you do have questions, please place them in the Q&A and either direct them as more general questions or direct them directly to one of the panelists.
Okay. Are you seeing these slides clearly?
Not yet. Yeah, there you go.
Okay. So on my screen, things are flickering in a peculiar greenish glow, but I'll try to ignore that. So, and one more question. How many minutes should I aim for to keep us on track?
10 or 12, if you can.
Good. Okay. So, first, thanks to the Villanova team, Frank, Paul, and Kevin for the invitation and the opportunity to join the panel tonight. I'm looking forward to the conversation and learning from my colleagues. I'm going to say a few things about some of the same issues that Tom Ellison was talking about, but trying to introduce some historical perspective along the way. So the first thing I want to say is that there are plenty of environmental risks out there. That's normal. It has long been that way. I would say for the past 3,000 years, epidemics have been number one on that list. But I would say today, while pandemics are a growing risk, and we're still living in one, that climate change, which I break down into both shifts and shocks, is probably a greater risk to international stability and security. There's no way to be sure about that. That's just my gut feeling. The family of risks, as I call it, this list matches fairly well with Tom's list of potential impacts. The only one I have two that didn't appear on his list: insect-borne diseases and glacial outburst floods. I'm not going to talk about most of these. I'm going to talk mainly about sea level rise, but if anybody wants to hear what I think about the prospect of insect-borne diseases and how historical experience might enlighten us on that, all you got to do is ask. So whereas I'm willing to say that climate shifts and shocks now outrank pandemics as a general risk, I don't think it's easy to break down the, as I call them, family of climate risks into any kind of hierarchy or order, because it depends too much on where you are. So in some places, glacial outburst floods are a significant possibility, but in other places they aren't. Now, the first main point I want to make is that the historical answer to adverse climate change over the last 20,000 years is, for the most part, no longer available, and that is migration. And the main reason for that is that there are now 8 billion of us, but on top of that, there's a long history of suspicion and hostility towards strangers. It takes any number of forms. I list here nationalism, chauvinism, and racism. And those have been, in one way or another, part of the human experience for a very long time. The map is the last glacial maximum. Brexit 1.0 is when sea level rise turned Britain into an island. So the main reason why our solution to adverse climate change over the last 20,000 years is no longer available to us is summarized in this chart. Tom said a very good example with a chart that goes back 2,000 years. So I thought I'd try to pop that and go back, I guess that's 12,000 years. And as you can see, most of that demographic growth is very recent. As recently as 100 years ago, the situation was considerably different with respect to the availability of migration as a practical solution to adverse climate change. And in the example that I give here, 110 years ago, there's a major drought in the West African Sahel, probably more serious in a climatological sense than the one of the 1970s. But huge numbers of people were able to walk 200 miles south into what are now Nigeria, Benin, Togo, etc. And that is no longer an option, or is a problematic option, let's say. On top of that, nowadays, the proportion of people who have a fixed property and sunk investment, making it hard for them to move, is far greater than it was for most of, in fact, all of prior history. So there are other obstacles to migration as solution. I'm going to take a short dive, shallow dive into sea level rise for a moment. So we have a lot of experience with sea level rise, but it's a long time ago. The last surge of sea level rise was between about 12,000 and 7,000 years ago. It came in 3 big pulses here, and it was fast at certain points, much faster than what we've seen in our own time. So the last 100 years, we've had about 20 centimeters sea level rise. There were times 9,000 years ago when 2 to 4 centimeters a year was the rate of sea level rise. And this may have some connection to the abundance of flood myths around the world. Maybe, maybe not. But for the last 7,000 years or so, until fairly recently, sea level has been rather stable, especially the last 2,000 years. So our experience is, shall we say, lost to us. It's too old. And we don't have any useful historical memory of what likely lies ahead. Although it may be possible that experience of land reclamation is a proxy for coping with sea level rise. Land reclamation meaning making land out of the sea, or in most cases obliterating coastal marshlands and filling them in. And there's some parts of the world that have extensive experience with land reclamation. And I note 2 of them here, the Netherlands on South China, especially the Pearl River Delta. For those of you in Frank Galgano's Middle East class, I hope you enjoy that picture of the Nile Delta. Oops, let's go back to this one. Hang on. Oh, because one of my slides just doesn't want to show itself. Huh. All right, I'm going to have to skip one, which was about the differential risk of sea level rise compounded by shifts in the Earth's crust, so-called isostatic rebound. So there are parts of the Earth's crust that are recovering from glaciation. And the part of the world where this is most intense is actually the east coast of North America, which is actually, I should explain a little more, it is actually sinking as Canada is rebounding from the last glaciation. And Frank and Tom could probably tell you how many military installations are on the east coast of North America, but they are at risk not only from sea level rise, but simultaneously from subsidence because of the isostatic rebound from the last glaciation. So in a strange way, at least many people find it strange, the history of the last 20,000 years is sort of reaching out of the grave and affecting the 21st century. Now, the last point I want to make about sea level rise is how vastly specific risks are depending on local geography. And it is the world's river deltas that are probably the most consequential theaters for sea level rise. And the International Geosphere Biosphere Program has prepared a list of major deltas, which I've reproduced here. The ones towards the bottom are the ones that, in their judgment, are at most acute risk from sea level rise. And you'll notice that 3 of them are in China, and the last 7 or so are in East or Southeast Asia. But the Nile is also right up there. The only one in the United States that makes the list is the Mississippi Delta. And with apologies to any Louisianians, I would say the Mississippi Delta is not a crucial piece of the economy or military posture of the United States. looking at this map, you can see how the American hemisphere is, comparatively well situated from the point of view of its river deltas and the risk at which they stand. And Southeast and East Asia are at the opposite end of the spectrum. And I note at the bottom here that what's going to happen in all likelihood to the world's river deltas is going to be good for some people, at least the engineering firms that have experience building and maintaining seawalls. They're going to be in demand. A lot of them are Dutch. Okay, I'm going to close up here. So there's a huge body of historical evidence confirming a point that Tom touched on a moment ago, which is the socially divisive nature of natural calamities, and not necessarily weather and climate events, but the whole panoply of them. I list here earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanoes, etc. In a substantial proportion of cases, these generated conflict, sometimes violent conflict, the scapegoating of foreigners, which Tom has already mentioned, and scapegoating of minorities, characteristic response. But I want to make sure we don't lose track of an important counter current that many of these shocks has also generated. And that counter current has two pieces to it. One is the generosity of ordinary citizens, and there's a long record of this, documented back at least 250 years, and a record of interstate cooperation to deal with calamities, whether climate-related or some other natural phenomenon. That history is probably a little shorter than 250 years, but it is there, and it's important to bear in mind that there's opportunity as well as risk here. Next to last point, slow-moving threats have always been a weakness of human beings as individuals and as societies, and the urgent frequently trumps the important. That is, I think, part of the human mental equipment, and it takes a lot of training to overcome that. So that does not augur well, because while climate shocks are urgent, climate shifts, which play out over decades or centuries, there's always something more urgent that commands attention. So prioritizing what's really important has proven difficult and will continue to prove difficult. Last point I want to make is that in trying to address climate change, as you well know, a massive effort is underway to refashion the world's energy mix and reduce reliance on fossil fuels, which at present account for about 80% of the world's energy mix. But that's going to change. And as it changes, this will have enormous security implications, which I think might well be the most important thing about the connection between climate change and international security. I won't know for 200 years, but I think that's a distinct possibility. And the reason I think that is because prior transitions in the world's energy regimes have, it seems to me, held powerful implications for the distribution of wealth and power on the planet. So I have a shorthand here, Dutch and the Piet in the 17th century. The Dutch had a low-cost energy advantage in various industries, brewing, lime making, sugar refining, that they translated into an assertion of geopolitical power on the world stage, which is remarkable for a population of maybe 2 million people in the 17th century. More familiar examples to you are the way that Britain in the 19th century was able to harness the potential of coal, both economically and militarily, and the way that in the 20th century, the United States was able to do the same thing with oil. Well, what will the next energy regime look like? Will anybody be able to take advantage of it the way that, in my analysis, the Dutch, the British, and the Americans have done with prior energy regimes? And will there be direct military implications, as there most certainly were with oil? Those are my final remarks, and I cede the floor to whoever is next. And I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you very much, John. We'll go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Marcus King.
Thank you very much. So I'll reflect on a little bit of a different construct of climate security, really building upon what Tom was saying. And I'll rely a bit on some of my experience. I was in the Office of Environmental Security at the Pentagon. And at the Pentagon, we looked at climate security from a U.S. perspective in 3 areas, or 3 buckets, as people sometimes say. That was climate change security through the lens of mitigation, through the lens of adaptation, and then a third area, which is the consequence management of failure to adapt to climate change. And each is very important. And so the Defense Department is the largest energy user in the United States. United States is the largest energy user in the world. So by transitive property, those might say that DoD is the largest energy user globally. And that's fairly much true. And so there are opportunities for greenhouse gas mitigation associated with the military complex. And so this could be energy efficiency across installations globally. It could be renewable energy, hybrid vehicles, as the example that Tom illustrated in his slides there. So there's these opportunities around energy efficiency and hybridity, renewable energy as well. But then there's the effects of climate adaptation on climate security, and those were touched on as well. So that's really the impacts on military infrastructure based on climate impacts, and that could be sea level tides, it could be increased flooding, drought, desertification, wildfires, and then also melting of permafrost, which is something I'm sure that Marisol will touch upon, and the melting of permafrost's effect on military readiness in those areas. Also, in terms of adaptation, there are 1,700 military installations globally that are coastal installations. Hampton Roads military reservation is on the Virginia coast. It's the largest base taken together in the world, and that's affected by sea level rise. And so there's also the impact on the Defense Department in terms of the changing roles and missions that climate impacts represent. And again, that was alluded to by Tom, which is what we call the changing demand signal for humanitarian operations and how much that's really increased. So the amount of aid and assistance that the United States has rendered, for example, to Pakistan during the period of floods that they had in 2010, and once again in 2021, just the amount of relief supplies that were sent there, the fact that the United States will intervene, whether it be allies or perhaps even adversaries, in terms of providing assistance. And so Cyclone Nargis in 2007 is another example that happened in Myanmar, but yet the United States was there to render aid, and the military people in Pacific Command were those that were most able to be drawn upon. So you have mitigation, adaptation, and the effects of adaptation on changing roles and missions. But this is the third area that I mentioned, which is the implications of failure to adapt to climate change. What are those security implications? And so this has been the area where I've done my research and teaching. I teach environmental security courses at Georgetown. And my research, though, has really focused on water and climate change's effect on water. I like to say that in terms of climate impacts, the most visceral and most immediate impacts have to do with water. Sea level rise is a bit of a longer term concern, thankfully, but in terms of water stress, water availability, the impact of droughts, these are very immediate effects of water that can be felt universally. And so what I've looked at is the underlying fragilities in countries that may already be unstable, that may have the beginnings of state failure that are already happening. And then what are the concerns for the global community in countries which are already fragile that are then having increased impacts of climate change? And what will that look like? And then also thinking about what are the implications for migration, both internal dislocation and international migration as a result of these changes. And I think that'll be the topic of one of your coming seminars. So I'll just, preview that a little bit. So drought is something I've studied, and what drought has done in the context of the areas of the Middle East, North Africa that I have been researching is it's created ungoverned spaces, ungovernable spaces that have been more conducive to the advent of extremist groups, be that Boko Haram in Nigeria, Al-Shabaab in Somalia, other extremist groups across the Sahel, the band in Africa that stretches from the eastern horn of Somalia on the eastern side to the western side of Burkina Faso, that belt in Africa that has been affected by continual droughts. So the United States has estimated that 1.8 billion people will be living in areas of absolute water scarcity by 2030. 2/3 of the world by this time will be subject to some amount of water stress, not necessarily absolute scarcity. And so in the Middle East and North Africa, climate change is a real contributing factor to this water stress, as is in many places globally. But historically, these areas experience chronically arid conditions that are unpredictable, and there are unpredictable yet prevalent droughts. So regional predictions of these areas in terms of climate are calling for higher temperatures, more frequent droughts, and increased variability in precipitation, which has its impacts on agriculture. So as I mentioned, nowhere is this more evident than in the Sahel in Africa, which is about to experience more frequent and intense droughts, although they are historical, as Dr. McNeill pointed out. But what happens when the intensity of droughts combines with underlying tribal, ethnic, or sectarian cleavages that already exist in society? This has been called a threat multiplier, how climate change can impact on areas that are already fragile for reasons of divisions in society, whether these divisions have to do with class, whether they have to do with religion, tribal structures, but these are the underlying fragilities in society. And so what my research has found, as I had mentioned, was that at the subnational level, this gives an opportunity for non-state actors to step into conflict across a spectrum of campaigns, be these insurgencies and civil wars. And this has been what my recent book has been about. So what I looked at was in the years from 2011 to 2017, there was a historical wave of droughts that crossed the Eastern Mediterranean into Syria and Iraq, and also affected the Horn of Africa during the same time period. So I used this time period as my analytical framework to look at all three of these examples. And so I began by looking at the civil war in Syria and Iraq, which coincided with a drought, and began to understand and look at ways in which subnational actors came to weaponize scarce water resources. So an infamous example that, again, I think Tom alluded to was the seizure by ISIS of control of the Mosul Dam, a large dam on the Tigris River back in 2014. And so what happened was seizing this infrastructure allowed ISIS to project virtual control over a large area in a strategic way. In fact, if they had blown up this dam, it could have released a wall of water that would have washed itself all the way down the Tigris to the Green Zone, which was the area occupied by the Allies in Baghdad. So it could have had amazing effects, what I would call strategic effects. In Raqqa, which was the de facto capital of ISIS in Syria, the organization there collected taxes in exchange for water resources. In Somalia, which was the other case study I looked at, with drought as a backdrop, al-Shabaab was able to change their traditional hit and run tactics and be able to use water as an actual resource on the battlefield, in order to poison wells, in order to withhold water from various groups, along with humanitarian assistance in areas that they controlled. So as climate change increases, this will be a greater concern in a lot of these areas. I also looked at impacts of climate change in Nigeria and the Middle Belt. So this is a transition zone between more of the lush Niger Delta in the southern area of the country, along with the arid Northeast. So it's between these two areas. And so there's been a protracted conflict, which has pitted semi-nomadic Muslim herdsmen against predominantly Christian farmers. So you hear a lot about farmer-herder violence and how that's been exacerbated by droughts across this region. And that is one of the primary impacts and conflict drivers to these areas, which are experiencing shrinking land and grazing land and shrinking water supplies. So a litany, I would say, of global impacts of climate change, including higher temperatures, changes in precipitation, extreme weather, and sea level rise, are steadily expanding the footprint of global water stress. And as this happens, potential battlescapes where water can be weaponized are growing in tandem with the effects of climate change. So that's been the most recent work I've done. But again, looking at water and the impacts of climate change on water, I've been interested in transboundary basins that are shared, river basin systems shared by multiple countries, and what have been the impacts of climate change, especially when you have, for example, in the Southeast Asia, in the Mekong River Basin, you have the unilateral development by China of dams. So on the one hand, you have dams that are withholding, impounding water, but on the other hand, there are the impacts of climate change. So China has been relying more upon hydropower as a potential clean source of energy production, and they need to utilize that in order to probably meet their greenhouse gas reduction targets under the Paris Accords. But in the meantime, climate change has also had an effect on the Mekong River Delta in the region, in those countries associated with that region. So you've had sea level rise, which has contributed to erosion on the banks. Dr. McNeill spoke about the Nile Delta. The Mekong Delta is the fertile zone in this region where rice is cultivated. That area has been flooded. There's been saline intrusion from the sea level rise, but also record droughts from year to year. And so food insecurity in this region is a distinct possibility. And what has happened is this is beginning to drive migration, but especially rural to urban migration. So the cities are becoming a little more congested. And it's also been more of a challenge for the governments to provide municipal services, including water, to those people that are newly arriving to these areas. Another example that I've studied is the same dynamic is sort of unfolding in Egypt. So in Egypt, you have the unilateral construction of a dam by Ethiopia. Ethiopia is the upstream country in the Nile, the White Nile river system. And so you've got the same phenomenon repeating itself. You've got the idea that water's being impounded upstream by Ethiopia, specifically at a time when climate impacts are becoming more noticeable and more destructive in Egypt. And so one thing I did was I worked with some folks from the Kennedy School at Harvard University, and we developed a scenario of Egypt in 2030. And that we played this scenario out in the United Arab Emirates Diplomatic Training Academy, where we had 40 regional desk officers, both from the military and from embassies. And we played out this scenario where sea level rise is affecting the deltaic area in Egypt. Desertification is pushing the desert closer into the narrow, fertile zone that borders the Nile. So you've got, again, saline intrusion, desertification, drought, and what would this mean? And so the next move in this scenario exercise that we did with the diplomats found that there was the potential for environmental migration again, and that this migration would be in an area that's very congested. Obviously, Egyptians would not be moving to Israel, but also the conditions, the chauvinism that was mentioned earlier, the nationalism, this sort of government and governance constructs has made it difficult to accept migrants or refugees into Southern Europe. And so Southern Europe also wasn't an option. And so what was found at the end of this exercise was that regional organizations like the Gulf Cooperation Council, NATO, even the specialized organizations of the United Nations that were not set up in a way to allow people to deal with this sort of humanitarian crisis. And so people found that to be very credible. And so new regional organizations and new international alliances might be necessary to deal with climate-induced migration. That is something that we really found. And so, as I had said, I'll just whet your appetite a little bit about climate migration, because I know there's an upcoming seminar on that. And so I would say that climate migration is now an emerging issue that's captured the attention of policymakers. The National Security Council under the Biden administration has commissioned a report on international migration and what that means from a security perspective in the United States. And so looking at it historically, it's been world wars, perhaps even a conventional war like the war in Ukraine, that's long been the historical driver for international refugee crises. However, recently we're finding that climate change disasters are increasing the displacement and increasing displacement. So in 2017, there were 30 million people displaced across 150 countries due to natural disasters. According to the UN High Commission on Refugees, 90% of refugees now, under the mandate of the UN Commission on Refugees, are from countries that are in what they characterize as the front lines of climate change. So estimates of environmental displacees, I won't call them refugees, environmental migrants, range from 200 million to over 1 billion by the year 2050. And so the Secretary General of the United Nations has now said that climate change is a key factor accelerating all other drivers or exceeding all other drivers of displacement. So many people do remain in their own countries. That's internally displaced people, but many people will also be driven across borders. And so in the context of climate change, the people that are driven across borders are environmental migrants, but they do not qualify for protection under in an international law. So environmental refugees are not an actual concept at this point. It's environmental migrants. And so it would take an amendment of the Refugee Convention of 1951. It would take thinking about new security arrangements. And what I'd finally just say is that this is a pertinent issue for the United States. There is an area in Central America called the Dry Corridor, which is Nicaragua and Honduras and El Salvador. And in this region, as areas are becoming less fertile, as agriculture is becoming more damaged, again, you've got that rural to urban migration, which is pushing more migrants across Mexico, and more Central American migrants, as you know, are entering now the United States rather than Mexico. So there are these drivers. They're relatively urgent. It needs to be sorted out. What is an environmental migrant? We need to understand whether there will be a change in structure over the years of the international migration regime to accept the idea of refugees, and then whether they would then be given the right to asylum under international law. And then the way to understand it, as I had said from this gaming exercise, that there needs to be new institutions and new ways of thinking, of organizations that could absorb these environmental crises. And some of them do have security implications for the United States in countries that are fragile or in countries that have become ungoverned. So that's all I would have to say, and I'm looking forward to everyone else's presentations, and it's really great to see everybody here on the call who I've worked with most of you.
Thank you so much, Dr. King. Ms. Marisol Maddox next.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here on such a panel with such wonderful colleagues. Really loving listening to all of your presentations. So I'll talk to you today about the Arctic, which many of the panelists probably already know about, but for the audience, the Arctic is warming 4 times faster than the global average in recent decades, and the Arctic Ocean is actually acidifying 4 times faster than the global ocean average. So we're just seeing immense change from this region that has enormous consequence, and we'll get into why. So let's first be clear about what we're talking about when we say Arctic. There are many slightly different technical definitions of the Arctic, but it roughly refers to the region above the Arctic Circle, which is 66 degrees north. And so the states with territory above the Arctic Circle are the United States because of Alaska, Canada, Iceland, Denmark because of Greenland, Finland, Sweden, Norway, and Russia. And so collectively, these are referred to as the 8 Arctic states. China caused kind of an uproar back in 2018 when they released this now infamous white paper that referred to themselves as a near Arctic state. And so just want to clarify, this is not a status that we recognize, that anybody recognizes. But it's interesting because part of China's rationale for why they feel so able to assert themselves as a near Arctic state is because of the ways that they are and will be heavily impacted by Arctic change, particularly something like sea level rise and how that could impact their coastlines. But by that logic, every nation in the world would be a near Arctic state because the changes that we're seeing in the region have impacts for the entire globe without exception. So partially that's because of global carbon cycling being very complex and interactive, which is one of the reasons that there's concern about the potential for global carbon tipping point thresholds to be crossed, which I was glad that Tom brought up in his presentation. And so you can think about tipping points as essentially that point at which, if you're in a canoe, for instance, and you're kind of going back and forth, rocking, it's that point at which you either are going to be able to go in the other direction or you've committed in this direction irreversibly and you're going to flip over. And so that's kind of a way of conceptualizing kind of some of the thresholds that we're concerned about hitting with global carbon cycling in terms of critical inputs to the global carbon system that if they go in a certain direction for long enough, there are questions about if they are irreversible. And there's further research demonstrating that because of how interactive the global carbon cycle is, that crossing the threshold of one tipping point actually risks creating a domino effect. And so the best possible course of action is, of course, not to test how far we can push and for how long, but to really take seriously our commitments to reduce emissions and to be actively sequestering carbon in ways that are also supporting ecosystem health, because the services that are provided by intact and healthy ecosystems really are underappreciated in terms of the ways that they underpin the basic fabric of societal health and the ability to have flourishing communities. So there are several global climate tipping points associated with Arctic change, but I will just name 2. So the Greenland ice sheet and also the physical integrity of permafrost, which is permanently frozen ground. So the Greenland ice sheet is so big that it actually generates its own gravitational pull of the ocean towards itself. And so it's melting from the top down and the bottom up, but it's also, so it's contributing to sea level rise in that way. And it has about 21 feet of global sea level locked up inside. But because of the way that the Atlantic Ocean circulation works, as the Greenland ice sheet melts, it's not only contributing to, increasing the global sea level average, it's actually pushing it towards the eastern seaboard of the United States, which interacts in a really interesting way with some of the topics that Professor McNeill brought up about the issues that the eastern seaboard of the United States is already experiencing with land subsidence and the isostatic rebound. So the other topic I wanted to mention was permafrost. So this makes up about 15% of the entire northern hemisphere, and it contains about twice as much carbon than the atmosphere. So this is, just a tremendous amount of carbon, very ancient carbon, millions of years old when you get down pretty far, that is locked up, that is starting to be activated by, the amount of warming that we've been seeing. And it's been very recently become clear that things are changing a lot faster than expected. And in particular, there is a concern about the amount of methane that's being released from the permafrost, because it's a much more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. So there are three kind of points associated with this that I want to make, which is that what we're starting to see from the amount of emissions that are coming from the thawing permafrost is that our current climate models have significant flaws in that before 2021, they didn't include permafrost at all, and they only account for it currently in a linear way. So they don't account for any of the abrupt thaw events like these methane craters that have exploded across Siberia, or hill slope collapse, or thermokarst lakes. Any of these things that we're seeing, these phenomena that we're seeing extensively in the Arctic, are not accounted for. So that's really important for understanding how quickly we could start to see certain changes for our own ability to understand the timeframes that we're working with in terms of policy. And then the same thing for our carbon math, which is basically that we think that, okay, if we reduce our current anthropogenic emissions, right, like what's coming from the energy sector, from agriculture, if we can reduce that by this amount, by this date, we should be good. But the carbon accounting is wrong, because they're not accounting for the compensation that we need to do for the amount of emissions that are coming from permafrost. So that's also, in terms of policy, something that is really important to understand. So we actually need to be more ambitious than we've realized. And then at the same time, there's also now high confidence that we will be seeing much higher levels of change and potentially triggering some of these tipping points at lower levels of warming. So it's actually more important than ever to not be giving up on the larger goal of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. And then actually just had one follow-up from what Tom had brought up about when we may cross that threshold. And one of the things I was looking into recently is about the way that La Nina has actually been buffering the amount of warming that we've been experiencing. And so as we're transitioning into an El Nino dominant shift, that we could actually hit 1.5 next year. So that's pretty alarming, and just shows again, like, we need to be taking this seriously. And all of this speaks to also the growing body of evidence for recognizing this concept of actorless threats, which I think is really important to understand and to distinguish from a traditional actor-based threat, whether it's a state or a non-state actor. And that's important because it requires a completely different approach in terms of understanding how the threat will develop. You can't deter climate change like you can try to deter Russia, right? So it takes a totally different approach. We need to be doing things like really bulking up anticipatory intelligence and having a much higher level of integration with the scientific community to have that. And then also it's important to distinguish, what makes actorless threats different, because we also need to think how we minimize risk that we face from that threat. And so at the heart of the climate threat, when you look at it, it's really about relationship. This is, humans caused it and humans can fix it, but we need to address this really distorted perception that somehow humans are separate from the environment. And that has really informed the way that the dominant paradigm has evolved, and the worldview that doesn't understand that, human and environmental health are inextricably intertwined. So I'll just end. I do want to tie in that, at the same time that we're dealing with literally the most complex threat we've ever seen, we're also dealing with these traditional security dynamics. So these have evolved separately, but are certainly not separate from the climate crisis. And one of those includes Russia. So Russia is a legitimate Arctic state. They've tended towards embracing international law in the Arctic to the extent that they stand to benefit due to having such a long Arctic coastline. So under international law, they have a lot to gain. So they've been, with the exception of their interpretation of the status of the Northern Sea Route, and which they're seeking to develop and monetize, they have been abiding by international law in the Arctic because of having so much to gain. And so they have a lot of oil, gas, coal, minerals in the Arctic zone. And so they are really seeking to develop these resources. They want to limit stranded assets like oil, gas, and coal, which, they're seeing the kind of global shift towards decarbonization and wanting to extract these resources and sell them so they can make money before they become stranded assets and they can't sell them. And we've seen that since the war, Russia has really doubled down on their Arctic ambitions. They're seeking new commercial partners to replace those that have left, and they've elevated the region in terms of its strategic significance in documents like the latest maritime doctrine. And of very high significance is the Kola Peninsula, which is at the heart of Russia's bastion defense concept, which is where they house their strategic submarines. So they're not immune to climate impacts. And in waging war in Ukraine, they have really crippled partnerships that are crucial to their ability to diversify their economy away from oil and gas, and to better understand their exposure to climate hazards, and then to be able to mitigate and adapt. And so this is concerning for global climate cooperation on top of all the other security concerns associated with aggressive and weakened Russia. So it's really that combination of the strategic geography with the acceleration of climate change and the region becoming more accessible from a security and commercial standpoint that has led the U.S. to deepen and strengthen engagement in the region, and to build structural equities and more enduring presence to support our strategic interests. And so there was a new national strategy for the Arctic region, which came out in the fall, and there will be an implementation plan that will be released in the early spring. And so I want to end on just 3 quick takeaways. Was one, we need to take the emissions reduction and carbon sequestration seriously. We're dealing with very complex, constantly evolving and interacting systems, which Tom had also mentioned. And it means that our approach towards solutions must also be about systems. Otherwise, there's a very high risk that we will not account for all the variables that we need to pay attention to, and that that there's a risk of creating externalities that actually exacerbate related problems that then undermine our ability to be effective. So I'll stop there, and looking forward to any questions.
Thank you so much, Marisol. While Mark is opening up his slides, I asked Mark to sort of conclude as our speaker, because he did spend a good part of last year actually working in a forward U.S. military headquarters, and he can give you some light into exactly how seriously the Department of Defense is taking this problem. So please, Mark, go ahead.
Okay, thanks, Frank. Thanks to you and the Villanova team for organizing this, and thanks to my fellow panelists. Really informative. And Marisol, I think a good setup, as you'll see here in a minute. And I'll go through this as quickly as I can. I know everyone has things they need to move on to, but basically my comments this evening are based on both my area of interest as a career Army officer and also my academic area of interest related to climate change and national security. And then, as Frank mentioned, my recent experiences serving as a member of U.S. Africa Command. Had the opportunity to spend 6 months there and really to help the command begin to understand and plan for the security implications of climate change in Africa, which is really a monumental challenge. Help to get the ball rolling, and the ball is rolling, and I remain in contact with them, and it's exciting to see some of the things that are happening there, but a long way to go. I just want to add that although I'm an Army officer, my remarks today are my own and don't necessarily represent an official view of the DoD or West Point. So this is briefly what I'll cover. The Department of Defense has been studying climate change for over 20 years now, with a keen eye on how climate change might affect our national security. And currently, there is significant emphasis within the DoD, as captured by the statement that our Secretary of Defense made in April of 2021. You can go back as far as the 2008 National Defense Authorization Act. That's when Congress, those are the acts that Congress basically uses to fund and direct the military what to do. I won't go into the details of that, but that was the first one where we really saw Congress direct the Department of Defense, and I'll quote from that act, to assess the risks of projected climate change to current and future missions of the armed forces, update defense plans based on these assessments, including working with allies and partners to incorporate climate mitigation strategies, capacity building, and relevant research and development, and to develop the capabilities needed to reduce future impacts. So again, some people are surprised that the DoD has been involved for as long as we have. And of course, it's ebbed and flowed over time. But more recently, you can see, and a couple of these have been mentioned already, several key strategic documents that have come out in the past, just in the past couple of years. But the question remains, well, these are helpful and they have received a lot of attention and following several of these, some funding. At the operational level, it's a great strategic guidance, but how a lot of lower level commanders, units, organizations, and staffs remain asking themselves, how do we actually operationalize this? And that's where I'd like to turn my attention now to AFRICOM and some of the work that I was able to do last year. So in 2021, the National Intelligence Council completed a study titled Climate Change and International Responses, Increasing Challenges to the U.S. National Security through 2040. The map you see here is an extract of that, showing vulnerability to climate change mapped at the country level. And the darker the country, the more vulnerable to climate change. You can see a clear arc here through an arc of vulnerability through Central Africa. As Marcus mentioned some of these specific examples in this arc already. I'll go into a couple of the vulnerabilities. Some have been mentioned previously. No way I could cover them all, but I'll highlight a few in a minute. But first, let me spend just a minute explaining what U.S. Africa Command is. So the Department of Defense organizes itself around what it calls combatant commands. Some of these are functional, like Space Command and Cyber Command, but 6 of them are geographic, and you can see those here. Africa itself, obviously a vast and varied continent, over 1.3 billion people, 1,000 ethnic groups, 2,000 languages, 54 countries on a continent that's larger than Europe, China, India, and the US combined. It's got a rapidly growing population. By 2050, a quarter of the people on the planet will be African. And it's also, as we all know, home to many of the world's most fragile and least developed states. In this setting, Africa Command, U.S. Africa Command is charged with the mission you see here. It's an incredibly challenging task, especially given the limited resources at their disposal. And at the bottom list I've listed 4 of AFRICOM's priority areas, really what they focus on to help accomplish their mission. So let's circle back now to climate change. It's not really hard to see, I think if you look at this mission and these lists, it's not hard to see how a changing climate complicates this mission and these priorities. And as I stated previously, nowhere outside the polar regions is experiencing the effects of climate change as much as Africa. These are just a handful sort of high-level impacts. These are taken from the IPCC's 6th assessment report published within the past about year and a half. If you read the IPCC, you'll quickly understand how the impacts of climate change in Africa, that they're not future, they're happening now. So let's take a look at how these affect security. And again, several of our previous panelists have mentioned these, so I won't linger. But we are already seeing an increase in humanitarian assistance and disaster response missions. That affects not only the US, but also obviously African nations, as their militaries, like ours, are often the best, most capable first responders, not necessarily designed for that, but often get called on to do so, which affects their security as it affects our security when it pulls it away from some of our primary missions. Dr. King mentioned some of these, specifically water being weaponized, malign actors leveraging this, decreased agricultural production that's already happening across Africa, particularly in the Sahel. I won't linger here, as Dr. King gave some great specifics on the impact of climate change, but it is one, probably the most prevalent example of a changing climate. Now, not all of the degradation and conflict that we see in the Sahel is due to climate change, but certainly climate change is not helping. It's really only exacerbating the problems there. You may have heard about another example, may have heard about significant devastating flooding in KwaZulu-Natal province in South Africa last April. I had the opportunity to spend some time in South Africa last year. It's over a period of several days. The unprecedented rainfall resulted in devastating floods, killed 435 people, at least displaced thousands, and resulted in over $1.5 billion in damage. It's a significant port, industrial area, as well as obviously residential areas. This resulted in a national state of emergency and deployment of military troops. The headline there says 10,000. I don't know if 10,000 troops actually deployed, but in a country with a defense force of only 75,000, an army of 40,000, that whatever deployed, it's not an insignificant number. And for all those soldiers deployed, helping with recovery operations, they're not executing their primary missions. I will note that I'm always reluctant to attribute a single meteorological event like this to climate change, but this example certainly fits with a pattern that we expect to see in this part of the world with a changing climate. All right, so let me turn now finally to how AFRICOM is dealing with this. How are they operationalizing this? So these are some of the steps that the command has taken over the past year. Started off about just over a year ago, really, on what we called a campaign of learning to understand the security implications of climate change. Not a lot of climate experts on the AFRICOM staff, some great staff officers, really smart people, but just don't know a lot about the specifics of climate change. So really reached out to a network of partners across US government, academia, NGOs, African partners. We put together, organized a symposium series. They've executed 2 of those symposia, one at their headquarters in Germany, one in DC, and they're planning a 3rd this coming summer or spring in Africa, on the continent of Africa. They've adjusted their organization and staffing. They've increased, instead of this being an additional duty for staff officers, is actually an office now that's looking at this full time. Significant cooperation with their interagency partners, including the U.S. Agency for International Development, the State Department. They've incorporated climate change into their strategy, into their plans, and also into recent simulations, and they'll do so with exercises in the future. The bottom line, it's moving forward. It's a huge task, a lot of work still to do. But let me go back now to just about a year ago. And I know that's a lot of font for a slide. I'm probably breaking breaking some rules on that, but really just an excerpt from General Townsend's annual command posture testimony to Congress that he gave last year. That's really an annual update that each of the geographic combatant commanders gives to Congress. And the transcript's available online. Last year's it's approximately 10-page document. It's not too long. Leading up to last year's posture testimony, I'd prepared a white paper and briefed General Townsend on the security implications of climate change, but I didn't know how or even if climate change would feature in his posture testimony. In a place as vast as Africa, with as many challenges as they face, there's a lot to cover in a relatively short testimony. Well, as it turned out, climate change and its security implications was really the first issue that General Townsend addressed in his testimony. And you can see part of what he stated to Congress here. And he really moved the command forward. He's since departed command, and there's a new commander, but the command continues to move forward on addressing and really operationalizing what they're doing to address the challenges and some of the opportunities that present themselves with the security implications of climate change in Africa. So I think I'll stop there. I know we're short on time, but I look forward to any questions that I might have the opportunity to answer.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mark. So I'll just go into the Q&A, and we do have a question to all panelists here. Do you think with the frequency and severity of natural disasters steeply rising, we might see a loss of statehood, and with that, a potential rise of local non-state actors that fill the vacuum in heavily hit regions? So please feel free to jump in.
I'll jump in just quickly. I don't think we're going to see a shift away from statehood. I do think we're going to see, as Marcus mentioned, an increase in ungoverned spaces. I think we're going to see an increase in non-state actors leveraging some of the effects of climate change, whether it's water changes and water shortages or migrations, to exploit those ungoverned spaces to delegitimize states that are maybe fragile.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that, I agree. I think there's kind of two components to that question. One is like the ungoverned spaces within states that Marcus and Colonel Reed addressed. I don't think the concept of statehood is likely to change, but there are some particularly like small Pacific Island nations that have also not coincidentally been really at the forefront of pushing the international legal system to acknowledge climate refugees as sort of a official legal status. Some of these countries really do face like truly existential threats to the livability of their territory. So over the longer term, that could pose some serious questions for for international lawyers and people of does an island that's no longer habitable, like who holds their UN seat, right? Like what is the obligation of the international community, to the population of that state, et cetera. Yeah.
I would add, and I tell my students in classes based on my experiences in the Middle East and in Central Asia, the problem is in many of those countries, governance only extends to the edge of the capital city. And once you leave that area, for the local populace, their security becomes a matter of their own personal initiative. And when you have things like disasters, that only exacerbates the situation. And in some cases, non-state actors, although they are acting with malintent, have actually provided better services than the government has. And they do that on purpose. And that is a bit of a problem in those areas. So we have another.
Actually, can I just add to that quickly?
Go ahead.
Yeah, so just kind of going off of that, I mean, another thing I've seen is where some of these non-state armed groups will purposefully sabotage the infrastructure that they know the state is not well equipped to replace, thereby further diminishing people's faith in government's ability to provide assistance. And I mean, honestly, I know a lot of what we've seen today and in general shows that the U.S. in relation to many other parts of the world, is considered to be facing less exposure to climate risk. But I would really push back on that. I think we're really underestimating the psychological disruption that we're going to be dealing with. And we're already seeing little hints of this with some of the water issues in the Southwest. In the United States, and the kind of, looking at the way that the whole Bundy situation worked out, and kind of some of those, there was somebody who'd bought land right next to where they control the water for a reservoir in California that was affiliated with that group, and was saying that, basically we'll just go in and we'll release the water so that the farmers downstream can have it. I think that there's a lot of ways in which governments across the board will increasingly be challenged to deal with the complexity of the disruption. And I think the mental health crisis in the United States, which is already seriously problematic, is only going to get worse if we don't really take this seriously and also account for that dimension and building individual and community resilience at multiple levels.
Very, very good. Thank you. So we have more of a focus question. Do we have a way of knowing if the 1912 drought in the Sahel it was the worst drought ever in that region? Either way, do we know what caused this mega drought, which came before the current age of global warming?
I'll take a shot at that one. So in the Sahel, as in many places, there's a very long history of drought, which is recorded in so-called natural archives. These might be pollen cores in a bog or lake sediments. They could be in other settings, not so much in the Sahel, in tree rings. So this is how we know about the severity of prior droughts, and scholars who specialize in this have prepared historical drought atlases of various parts of the world. So it's on that basis that I said that the 1912 to 15 drought in the Sahel was more serious than that of the 1970s, and more serious than any subsequent. Probably not the most serious ever. In fact, I can categorically say that that's not the case, but that is how we think we know what we claim to know.
Okay, thank you. Here, another question directed a little bit at Dr. McNeill, but also then the entire panel. Given the links between transitions in the use and sources of energy, i.e. peat, coal, and oil, and others, and long-term national security pointed out by Dr. McNeill, can the panelists speak about how important they feel the adoption of renewable energy technologies are for the long-term security of nations into the future? And how important do you feel the rapid adoption of renewable energy in the U.S. might affect our national security?
I'd be really interested in what security specialists think of this. My quick reaction to the question is that there's a great deal at stake in mastering the energy future, or potentially a great deal at stake. It's not clear to me that the next energy regime, whatever it looks like, will have the same consequences that prior ones have, in which certain powers around the world were able to take advantage better than others of the potential of past energy regimes. That may not be possible in the future, but it might be. And if it is, then it would behoove any power in the international system to try to master that potential fast and fully.
Yeah,
I would
Oh, go ahead, Marisol. Sorry.
I was just going to quickly add that I think that I've seen a really strong case for nuclear, and especially when you look at the geopolitics of kind of the whole green energy transition around minerals. And basically, I mean, the math's just not there in terms of, unless we're going to make serious environmental and justice concessions, we don't have the minerals that we need for the green transition. And so I think that nuclear is more important than ever. But I would also say that there seems to be like kind of tunnel vision on energy and like electric vehicles when you talk about climate. So I do just want to also point out that there are other areas where we can be making very significant contributions to reducing emissions and sequestering carbon, such as reevaluating our agricultural subsidies, regenerative agriculture versus this industrialized model, which, destroys water quality and soil health. And, that's an area where we could really make a difference that isn't talked about as often.
Yeah, I agree with both things said before. I think another two other things I'd point out are just that, I mean, there's definitely a security imperative to adopt those renewable technologies just to reduce the impact of climate change, obviously, but there's also kind of an energy security argument that's increasingly you see emerging, especially with the salience of the war in Ukraine and Putin's sort of use of natural gas and oil as an economic lever, a geopolitical lever to things like nuclear energy or solar or wind that are less reliant on daily flows of fuels from problematic states abroad, right? Like with nuclear energy, you can store years of energy in like a room-sized area, right? Or and then you also see this playing out with concern about the head start that China has in dominance of, especially the processing, but also the mining of some critical minerals. So there's a lot of effort being put into sort of building alternative supply chains for those things. But again, it's also not quite the same as a fuel that you have to receive every day or the lights go out, right? Cutting off a material, an industrial input is not quite the same as that. But those are definitely overlapping kind of national security arguments for that transition.
I would add something that seldom gets thought of as a practical matter for the Department of Defense. And I know Mark will probably agree with me. I was in tanks. When I was in the 3rd Armored Division, we had 300 plus tanks and thousands of vehicles. And we spend an enormous amount of effort guarding supply lines. Sometimes we use as much fuel to bring the fuel forward to the units that need the fuel. So the Department of Defense and its efforts to at least reduce its fuel requirements and forward deployed units is just very simply a tactical and practical matter for units deployed in the field as well, regardless of the effects of climate change and energy security. Just makes a lot of sense because of the logistics efforts and the security efforts we spend guarding the supply line. I don't know if you want to add to that, Mark.
Yeah, just briefly, this is my own speculation, but it's of course 30 years of doing this. I think we've had just a handful of what we call revolution in military affairs over the past several hundred years. I mean, we're talking big things like actually we'll go back 1,000 years, to the advent of gunpowder, flight, some of those that have really completely changed the way we defend, the way we think of security. And I think the energy transition, whatever that is, I think that is potentially the next major revolution in military affairs. And whoever gets it first, and there's all kinds of benefits to that, right? But whoever gets there first, and Dr. McNeill alluded to some of gave some examples of there's advantages to really aggressively pursuing that, and all kinds of benefits, but just from a purely security perspective, a lot of benefits to getting there first.
Well, I'll take this moment and I'll turn it over to Paul. So I would like to thank our panelists for their efforts tonight. This was a terrific presentation, and we covered many aspects of climate security, and I'm sure our audience out there learned many things this evening. So I thank you very much.